Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our interview webinar with Jeffrey Shaw on the topic of learning the lingo of your ideal client profile. I'm Matt Hensler, Vice President of Marketing with Tether Tools. And before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items that I wanted to get out of the way. First, this session is being recorded. And so everyone who registered will get a copy of that recording in the next few days. Second, I want to reiterate that this webinar is for you. That along with the teams at both Think Tank Photo and MagMod, we very much appreciate you taking the time to join this webinar. We want you to get the most out of the time and expertise that Jeffrey Shaw has generously given for us all today. And while I've prepared some questions that I'll use to guide the interview, we definitely want you to have the opportunity to post questions too. So make sure that you use the chat window and put any questions you have in there so that we can get to a lot of those over the course of the discussion. The third thing I wanted to mention is, this is a little bit unorthodox for this sort of venue, but we're actually going to give away a couple of copies of the book. The first one happening now at the beginning of this event. And so already selected a winner, Winston Morona. You will get a copy of the book Lingo from Jeffrey Shaw. And so we'll get in touch with you following the webinar to make sure that we can get that copy out to you. So Jeffrey, I feel like I've probably let you sit there long enough on screen. And so I definitely wanted to greet you. Thank you for taking the time to be here and welcome.
Hey, well, thanks, Matt. I'm thrilled to be here with you and everyone watching in. Thanks for having me.
So as we got the word out about this webinar, of course, we told people about your prolific career as a photographer. We've shared that you're a TEDx speaker and a keynote speaker many times over. We've mentioned the fact that you have a very popular podcast with the Creative Warriors podcast. And of course, we're here to talk and learn more about the topics that you go in depth about in your book, Lingo. But I had a little bit of fun on this slide, obviously, with your title. And I think that plays into the discussion and definitely some of the topics that we'll get into later in the interview. But of course, this idea of, with all of those great accomplishments that we highlighted, I think, you identifying as self-employed is something that resonates with you.
Yeah, most definitely. In fact, I'd love to tell the story, particularly when I'm speaking at HR events, that I've never had a job. And I love that at HR events because I'm probably the only person in the room that has literally been self-employed their whole life. So yeah, I started selling eggs door to door when I was 14 years old. I lived in the country, would borrow my mother's Cutlass Supreme, this massive car. I could barely see up over the steering wheel, and I would go door to door selling eggs. And I tell you, Matt, I honestly, looking back, I learned so much in that experience because, for one, I charged $1.25 a dozen eggs, which the market, according to Google, the marketable price at that time was 79 cents. So I knew I was charging more than what was typical. So I therefore, as any of us in business, like, well, what justifies that? Because every time there's a no in our businesses, it's our fault. Like, whenever we hear no, it's because we haven't closed the gap between what the perceived value and what the cost is. So my concept was, and it was more than door-to-door service, because that to me wasn't even a big enough differentiator. The big differentiator was that they were farm fresh eggs, right? So this is, we're talking 1978. So in a way, I was like way ahead of the curve on free range eggs. But that to me was the big thing. And it was particularly important because this was a community, a town, small town about 2 hours north of New York City, which was to become the production headquarters for IBM. My father was one of the first 90 employees for IBM.
Wow.
So it was a nothing of a company at the time. But what you had in this community were a bunch of New Yorkers that were transplanted on farm country, and nobody was happy being there, right? So the idea of having these farm fresh eggs was really cool to them. That's what made it incredibly marketable. So I learned real quickly on, which played out everything in my photography business. I wound up being this uber expensive portrait photographer. And I learned then how to justify, what you needed to do to justify expenses. And the other big thing I learned is I was scared to death. I was a terribly shy teenager. And to go on knocking on people's doors to sell eggs was about as scary as anything I could do. But that to me, that's what being self-employed is all about. Like, we do crazy stuff. Like, we do stuff that we're afraid of for something bigger than maybe we can even identify. And for me, the bigger thing was, the money is great, but how many of us do what we do entirely for the money? For me, I was fascinated by putting the pieces of a puzzle together to make a business run. And that, to this day, is what drives me. That's why I love coaching, because it's not my business. I just like the pieces of the puzzle.
It's interesting that you brought up that story, which I wasn't expecting, but I'm now noticing that over the last couple of months, I've actually been driving out of my way to go get farm fresh eggs and paying about double what I would normally pay in the store. And so this whole time I need to find someone who's still selling them door to door. I think that's what I'm taking away from that
it's
point.
It's a lost art. I don't think anybody's selling door to door. They don't know what they're missing.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk a little bit more about your work as a photographer. This audience today is, built up of people who are photographers. And so that's why I think your message has so much resonance, because you've been in their shoes. So talk to us about, how did you get involved in photography? Where did you get your start?
Yeah. So, and to clarify, it's been 35 years, right? So I started out when I was 20. So there you go, do the math. So I was 20 years old. Honestly, I enjoyed photography as a hobby in high school, really as a way to get away from everything else in high school that I was afraid of. Gym class, cafeterias, again, really shy kid. So dark rooms back in the day were the ultimate. I'm one of the few students in high school that actually got a pass from the guidance counselor, who recognized that I was so terrified of people that I got a free pass to just be in the dark room all the time. Like, I didn't have to go to gym. I didn't have to do most of what the other students had to do. So I was obsessed. I just really enjoyed, the chemistry. Again, I like to see things develop, whether it's a business or a photograph. I like to see things develop. So, enjoying it as a hobby, I thought, well, I'll pursue this. But here's the thing, Matt. I was accepted to go to RIT, the Rochester Institute of Technology, but I chose not to go in the end, because it was a very scientific program, which I think is important in photography. But I just really wanted to understand how to make money at it. I knew if this was going to be my livelihood, I knew instinctively it was going to take more than being really good at something, that I also needed a business model. So I went to the Hallmark Institute of Photography, which is a 10-month program, but about 40% of the classes were business oriented, to the extent that we even had an in-school working studio. So we literally photographed clients and had to develop our own business model, pricing, make our own sales. So we were actually doing the business of photography while we were learning it. So it was a pretty exceptional education. Unfortunately, the school no longer exists. The industry's been, especially in education, has been hit hard. But it was a 10-month program, and I graduated from there, and I went back to my hometown to start a photography business. Now, mind you, I went to Hallmark thinking I was going to photograph architecture. That was something I loved to do. And again, didn't like people, so I was going to photograph inanimate objects. Somewhere along the way, I started putting people in the scenes, and that is when the magic clicked for me. I realized, man, what I love to do is that one-on-one intimate experience with people to create portraits. I just don't enjoy the studio, so I would do it all on location, which sounds simple now, but honestly, in the mid-'80s, that was pretty new in the world of photography to be photographing on location. So I went back to my hometown, this little country town, hadn't grown much over the years, thinking I was going to be a high-end photographer, and it was bust for the first 3 years. So I don't know how much. I can keep going on this story, but you might want to ask more questions about that.
Well, so then talk to us about how did you, as you developed as a photographer? Like, what were where did you turn for information, for ongoing education? What were your resources to continue to develop your skills during that early time?
Yeah. So I joined, PPA, Professional Photographers of America. To this day, I'm still a member, still a fan, actually more of a fan today. As an organization, I'm so impressed with what they've adapted. They've become an actual legislative force for copyright protection, and very involved in what's going on today with the PPP and coronavirus. So amazing organization. So I joined them right away. And I also joined the Massachusetts state. Now I lived in New York, but I went to school in Massachusetts. So most of my friends are from there. So I chose that state affiliate. It was an interesting, and I would recommend this for everybody. It's sort of a bit of a paradox.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, I'm facing the same paradox now as a speaker. And that is that there's a way in which you want to surround people. You want to surround yourself with people, your peers, people who can educate you, teach you, mentor you, and you can stretch. But you also have to be very careful that you also leave enough room in that to be yourself. So I dove in deep into the associations to get myself started. But then honestly, Matt, I pulled back for years and had absolutely no connection with any other photographer. My closest friend was a photographer I went to school with, but when he and I got together, we didn't discuss photography. But other than that, I didn't hang out. I mean, I was still a member of the organizations. Maybe occasionally I attended a meeting, but I found it to be critically important that I pulled back to create in the photography business something that didn't exist at that time. And I think the only reason I was able to do that is because I just separated myself and stayed true to what felt right to me.
Yeah, it's interesting because to your point, you can learn a lot from your peers, but then you start to, maybe mirror and mimic the success of others versus sort of being true to yourself and sort of figuring out your own path forward, right? It's like, let me take what makes sense for me from those learnings, but then carve out my own way. And it sounds like that's really what you started to focus on.
And I think what happens is it starts creating a lot of self-doubt, right? I mean, if I had actually thought about what I was creating as a photographer, I mean, I could have easily been convinced out of it. So to summarize that, I'd say, I modeled portrait painters, not photographers. So again, this was mid 80s. I'll back up to that kind of foundational story because there's a couple lessons in there I think that I really want photographers to get. So as I said, I struggled for 3 years in my hometown and was failing. At a turning point moment when a woman came into my studio to ask about having her family photographed, and I made my usual pitch about having photographs to hand down from generation to generation and having photographs to preserve your children's memories. And when I was done, she said to me, "That sounds great and all, but I don't have the luxury of worrying about my children's memories. I don't know how I'm paying my rent this month."
Wow.
Right? Super powerful. And that was a life-changing moment for me for two reasons. One is I realized that the reason I was failing, it wasn't that I wasn't good at what I did. It certainly wasn't that I wasn't working hard enough because I was busting my ass. The reason I was failing is I was literally barking up the wrong tree. That's where the concept of lingo comes from. I realized I am speaking a different language here than this person who's in this market, right? Because I'm talking about how one needs to plan ahead and photograph and preserve memories, and one needs to think long term. I mean, I've had life insurance since I was 19. I've always been that guy that thought long term. But this means nothing to people who are struggling to pay their rent that month.
Yeah.
And I realized I was so misaligned, and that's why I was failing. That brought me to a foundational learning that I think is important for everyone to really understand. I realized in that moment I had a choice. I could change everything that was true to myself to match this market, right? I think portrait photography is incredibly valuable. What you could charge for it is unlimited because of the impact of it. I could either change my values and just become a cheap photographer or discount photographer to match the market, or I could do what I chose to do, which is absolutely believe there's some market out there that will appreciate and value what I do. Mm-hmm. And what I decided to do is, let me step into that even more clearly, find that market, show up, and attract them. So I was no longer selling myself to anybody, but putting myself in the right place at the right time with the right brand messaging that was going to speak to the right market, that I wasn't going to be pushing my way to anything. I literally existed for that market to come to me. And that's exactly what I did. And that's what Lingo is based on, is that foundational principle that there's people waiting for you to show up. You just need to show up, standing out and letting them know you're there.
There was another moment that you mentioned in your book where you were a story that you shared about standing at a bank and you were getting ready to pay yourself, for the week. And there was a self-actualizing moment that also sort of like led to this pivot in your career toward, that was kind of the birth of like the Lingo concept. Talk to us about that moment and what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah, it was crazy. And it's, to this day, it's still, I can still feel the pain of that. It was a horrible experience. But it was constant, and the experience was constantly going to the bank. This is pre ATMs, when you had to go to a teller. And in order for me to put money in my personal account to live on, so you got the business account and you have the personal account. And all I needed to do was transfer, in this case, usually about $150 from my business account to my personal account in order for me to make it through the weekend, or maybe a little bit after that. And the countless number of times that, I literally got to the point where I'd be breaking out in sweats, waiting in the line, because I felt I was doing what I was told to do up to that point, which was fake it till you make it, keep yourself pumped. So I was doing that, but you know what? That teller knew my reality better than anybody. And that is something I learned. I studied Buddhism for a lot of years, and they have a very interesting perspective on money. And one of the things they teach is that money teaches truths, right? There's something foundationally truth to whether you're being honest with yourself based on how your money is actually showing up in your life. Whether it's you're pushing it away, whether you're overspending. There's a lot of truths in money. And the truth of the matter was, I had to face that I had a failing business, because I would get to that teller and I'd need to transfer $150, and she would look at me, and I say she because just the bank I branched in is most often a lady. She would look at me and say, "Sorry, sir, you don't have enough money to make this transfer." Wow. Right? There wasn't $150 in my business account to transfer to my business account in order for me to make it through a few days. Horribly, and I thought, well, how much is there? Like, a really embarrassing situation. That combined with, then this woman comes into my studio. That's when I realized, man, this isn't working. I have to figure out what does work. And that's when I pivoted and changed everything in a very short period of time, by the way. And I get asked that a lot. From awareness to a change of reality was shorter than you might think.
Yeah. Well, we'll get back to that process of sort of what you did in your photography business, but I want to skip ahead a little bit and now talk about you moving from being a full-time photographer to a brand message consultant. And I think in business, we often talk about like, what's the highest and best use of your time, especially as you grow a business. Being really judicious with your time becomes critical. So how did you decide that, your work as a brand message consultant, as a, someone who focused on educating others about the lingo of their clients, how did that supersede the important work you felt you had been doing as a photographer?
Yeah, honestly, if you asked me, I'd say maybe 12 years ago, why I was on this earth, I would say to be a photographer, right? Because I was all in. It's all I knew. It was what I was most passionate about. If you ask me today, I'll say, that 35 years in business as a photographer was the learning lab in order for me to know what I know now to help other people, right? Because now I'm able to step into actually service. How I got here, it's not like it happened overnight. It was very transitional. It started with really an interest in coaching. And that came from the fact that I had a business coach for 7 years, which I started in 1999, which is actually one of the peak years of my business. So I didn't start working with a business coach out of pain or need. I started because I was actually highly successful and found it really lonely. I was, and to be honest with you, and I don't know if I've ever shared this, but also recognizing, man, I had a lot of anger in my life. I was angry at a lot of people, and I didn't know where that was coming from. So I took upon this idea of a coach, which was kind of not very common at the time. It was such a fantastic experience. When he retired in 2008, I decided that I would educate myself to become a coach. It also happened to be just the beginning of the recession. And one thing I knew is I was likely to have more time on my hands. So I invested in a several-month program to get my coaching education. That evolved into speaking eventually. And I was at that time speaking and coaching entirely in the photo industry. I had for 12 years, 10 years, I think I had a 6-month photography business educational program. So I was only coaching and only speaking in the photo industry. but consistently realized that what I had to share were ideas that were bigger than the photo industry, because quite honestly, the photo industry can be pretty incestuous. It's a lot of the same information shared around, and I had different ideas, bigger ideas. I wanted more for photographers. So I was looking to kind of, how could I expand out of that? Wrote my book Lingo in 2018, came out in January of 2018. And that carved out this new role, was called brand message consultant, which I don't know that had existed. I mean, there's brand consultants, but I specifically work with the messaging. Are you saying the right things to the right people? Which goes all the way back to that lady in my studio when I learned that that's the reason why businesses don't succeed. They're saying the wrong thing. They might be saying the right things. Like I was saying what was right to me, but to the wrong people.
Sure.
Right. Or you're saying the wrong things to the right people, but there's something off. And that's why I review as many websites as I do, because I can pick up on it instantly from what somebody thinks they're saying to what's actually coming across. And fixing that break in brand messaging can change everything. I see it every day because that's what I do. So it's been an evolution, if you will. There was never been a long range plan as to this is where I was going to end up, or what I thought I'd be a photographer to the day I died. And I do very few. I do a few sessions a year. So I'm still shooting. I'm still in the trenches. I still get the market, but it's evolved to how can I help other people in a variety of industries be successful?
Well, at the risk of alienating some of our listeners, what camera do you shoot? Because I know that's an important question for a photographer.
It's a Canon. So
okay.
What are we at, 50-50 split, or I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's not an official poll. I'm sure there are definitely some judgments being made now, though.
But Matt, here's the cool thing I want to share with you. So the whole world's gone virtual overnight, right?
Right.
So, and all my keynotes were either canceled or switched to virtual events. So this is the coolest thing to me because, I really have, my head's not been strongly in photography for a number of years now, because the session, I photograph a handful of clients and they're my best clients. And, this is like mastery for me. I could do this in my sleep. So my head's not really there. As soon as the world went virtual, I thought, this is my opportunity to look different than any other speaker, because every other speaker is just going to pull out their webcam. And I pulled out my Canon, I pulled out the DSLR.
Yeah.
I figured out I have created the coolest setup. Like, it cannot be matched. I posted some still images of my virtual presentation in a Facebook group of 550 speakers, and they went nuts. They're like, how the hell did you create that look? I'm like, not telling you.
Yeah.
It's my differentiator. But what I'm loving is how it's bringing me right back to my roots as a photographer. So that Canon's getting more usage now than it does for still images.
Well, obviously, we're paying attention to that too. I mean, there's a lot of people who are starting to use their DSLR as a webcam. I know you mentioned software Ecamm Live. We've worked with them, and we've even had one of our pros using our Air Direct wireless device as a wireless live cam solution. So everyone's experimenting, right? They're rediscovering the depths of their gear bag and finding things in there that you can use in different ways to adjust to the current times. So one of the premises of your book, Lingo, was that you mentioned that you wrote it for those who you describe as non-linear thinkers. So tell me a little bit about that, because I think it resonates with our audience. And then how did that drive the content of the book?
Yeah, 100%. So if you were to ask me what my biggest pet peeve in life is, it is literally watching people be told to focus on one thing. I mean, I'm one of those, right? I'm one of us, and it makes no sense to me. Like, why tell the most creative thinking people with the greatest, as photographers, we have the best peripheral vision. Like, we could be looking in one direction and sense what's going on elsewhere. Like, we're so good at the pure art of photography. It trains your brain in a certain way. I always say, one of my clients said to me that I'm a chaos curator. And I love that, because literally that's what photography is, right? Like, it's a whole bunch of chaos. My brain is just trained to compose things from chaos, which is exactly what brand messaging is. So I have always been adamantly opposed to watching the most creative, fantastic people in our world being told to sit still, focus, pick a niche, find one audience to do one thing to, and it pisses me off. right?
Yeah.
And I wondered, how did we get here when the roots of so much art was based in the Renaissance period, when people were respected and revered for their multiple talents? Like, how did we end up here? So, I know my people. Like, I am the biggest advocate for people who can't pay attention. Like, awesome. Like, I want you to be, actually, my whole logo, my business is squirrels. I talk about chasing squirrels all the time. My newsletter is called the Nutshell Newsletter, because you're going to chase squirrels. Here's everything in one place. Like, that's the whole concept of it. So I knew when I was writing the book that that's who my people are, right? That's who my readers are. So I kept saying to my editor, we needed to write a linear book for non-linear thinkers, because here's the thing. We have to embrace our non-linear ways of being and the fact we can see more, hear more, and feel more. But as someone who is writing a book, I wanted to help, right? So we often need specific strategic action steps. I'm just now in the process of writing my second book, and it's going to have very much that same flavor, right? I respect you for who you are. I bring out a lot of concepts, but at the end of the day, I always give very specific action steps because that's what holds it together. Lingo was self-published, and it was to go to press on at 9 a.m. on January 18th or something like that of 2018. My editor and I were up till 4 o'clock in the morning because I had, being the creative thinker I am, I had this harebrained idea the night before, realizing that and every chapter had some exercises for people to do. But I was like, you know what? My people are not going to go back to every chapter. We need to take all those exercises and put it in one section in the back of the book. Are you game? And my editor was like, sure. So we stayed up till 4 o'clock in the morning to create an ending to the book where all the exercises from all the chapters were condensed, because that's linear I wanted to be for non-linear people, because I embrace and love the non-linear part of them, but I want them to actually take action. And we got it done. Thank God I had a great editor.
So you literally had a stop the presses moment as
we got the new documents then by 9 a.m. and because honestly, there would have been no stopping them. I mean, you own the presses, it would have been a huge loss of money. So we got it to them. But it was down to the wire, because I realized in the 11th hour, I was like, this is what non-linear thinkers need, the action steps, because then they'll take action.
Well, so I think you've made the great point that when you are in any business, photography specifically, you have to understand and find your audience, and you have to speak to them with a lingo and in language that resonates with them. So let's get into some of those strategies. I think Lingo is really is centered on the idea of the 5-step secret language strategy. So let's talk through each of those 5 steps, and we'll sort of learn a little bit about that process.
Okay. So I want to do one other thing first, because although I don't want to make the same mistake I actually made when I wrote the book. Another little quick story. The book was in the hands of the editor, and I started doing a podcast tour months in advance, because a lot of podcasts are recorded months in advance. And every host asked me the same question, which is what we haven't talked about yet. It was, well, how do we know who our ideal customer is? And I realized I wrote the entire book teaching how to attract ideal customers under the assumption that people knew who their ideal customer was. And I realized, wow, most businesses don't. So we had to rewrite that chapter, and it's chapter 2 in the book, right after the introduction, to explain that. So I think we probably should, if it's okay with you, let's tackle that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
Because otherwise, like I said, otherwise I'd be making the same mistake, giving you the tool to attract them, but you don't know who you're attracting. And my philosophy on this is actually backwards compared to what most people hear. But again, I always say, for us creatives, it's not the first time we've told we're backwards, right? So it's just what works. It's what works in the world today. I actually think we've always been, as creatives, we're always way ahead of the curve. So the actual way to define your ideal customer is actually to turn inward first, right? It's not an outward process. It's not you deciding per se who you want to go after. And that's the mistake I made in my hometown. And this is the mistake 99% of businesses make. They build the business they want to build, and then they run around it's a box, right? They build the box they want to build, and then they run around for years trying to get people to fit into the box they created.
Right.
It's backwards. The right way to build a business is to get really clear on who you're building it for, what their lingo is, and then build the business that speaks to them and you sit back and they show up. Now, I'm not being glib about it, not that it's entirely that easy, but it's almost that easy, right? You just have to make, it's a strategy to making sure you're getting in front of the right people. So the right way to define your ideal customers is to really get clear on what's your unique perspective. And this, I think, is very important for photographers because it is such a crowded industry. Pick any category: boudoir, portraits, weddings, pick any category of photography, and it's busy. There's a lot of people. So what separates everyone? It's not your service. Service is never a differentiator. Sorry to disappoint people, because anybody can increase their service, right? So it's not a service, not a differentiator. You certainly don't want price to be the differentiator, because if that's your differentiator, you're going to be on the losing end of that stick. The only thing that is really a differentiator is your unique perspective on why and how you do what you do. All right? You could line up 10 boudoir photographers. Every one of them has a story, a why, something that explains how they see what they do differently than everybody else.
Right.
Give you a clear example on this, having nothing to do with the photo industry, but it'll really make the point. A friend of mine in Laguna Beach, California, paddleboards every morning and has for years. No lie, he's literally a whale and dolphin whisperer. When he goes out on his paddleboard, those whales and dolphins come to him. When they have calves, they bring the calves to him. And it's crazy. He's been taking cell phone photographs for years that would blow your mind. He eventually invested in underwater equipment so he could dive in the water. And he has photographs of whales and dolphins that you just wouldn't believe. A couple of years ago, he finally compiled them in a book. And the book is called, I think it's Blue Laguna, Whales and Dolphins from a Paddleboarder's Perspective. Go on Amazon. There are more than 10,000 books on Amazon on whales and dolphins. Guess how many there are from the perspective of paddleboarder? One.
Yeah, I was going to say it'd be very few.
Right? One. That's what I mean by unique perspective. You can completely stand out if you get clear on how you see what you do differently than the person next door. And you have a unique story to it. There's something that drives that passion, why you've chosen that genre of photography. What is it? Highlight that, because people that connect with that value set, people that resonate for that story. As a photographer, I used to tell the story how I'm the youngest of 3 boys. And to this day, I have one photograph of my childhood, right? Whole host of reasons. Parents got bored, they ran out of money, a whole host of reasons.
Yeah.
But when I share that story, people that have a similar experience, they totally get it. And that they're the ones that will spend the most amount of money, because their value for photography, since they didn't have it, is off the charts.
Sure.
Right.
Well, I've heard you separately talk about how do you referenced a resource. So Sally Hogshead is a consultant and speaker. And so she has this concept. It's like a fascination index, or it's basically, there's an assessment. So if you search Sally Hogshead and fascination, you can do a self-assessment that kind of helps you discover what other people can find fascinating about you. There you go.
Not that I am obsessed with her at all, but I have her book right next to me.
Yeah.
How the World Sees You.
Yep. And so I think I've seen her speak before as well. And I think that's a great starting point for people to kind of go through and that self-actualization of, well, how do other people see me? And then how do I leverage that to then start down this path that we'll move on to now, which is that 5-step secret language strategy.
Correct. And as I mentioned, these 5 steps actually need to be unpacked in order to avoid the common mistake of building a box that you're trying to fit people in, right? So this is actually the order in which you want to gain a deeper understanding of your clients, which results in your ability to speak their lingo, right? So the first of those 5 steps is perspective. You can't even begin to attempt to build a business for anybody until you, without judgment, without assumption, understand the perspective of the people you're trying to serve. That was the turning point moment for me. When that woman in the studio told me she didn't have the luxury of worrying about her children's memories, that was the first time as a photographer, as a portrait photographer, I realized that what I did was a luxury item.
Yeah.
Because to me, there was nothing more important, right? Nothing more important because I didn't have any photos of my childhood, so I knew what the pain felt like. Nothing more important because you're supposed to plan ahead for the future, right? This is just natural for me. So, but I was speaking the wrong lingo. So that's the first time I understood it as a luxury product. So I realized at the end of the day, it's not a must to have. Like, you don't have to have it. So I then went on a 3-month study of what the perspective is of affluent shoppers. So I studied a lot of brands, but I wasn't studying the brand. I was paying attention to the emotional triggers that cause people to choose that brand. Because here is my feeling. I grew up lower middle class in a small country town. I ended up serving the wealthiest people in the country. And the only reason I was able to do that is because I realized that I didn't have to be from their world. But if I understood their world, I could serve them. Mm-hmm. So it became my job. So I literally set a deadline, as I often do for things. I gave myself 3 months to dive deep into understanding the world and the perspective of affluent people. And then I gave myself 3 more months to replicate it in a newly branded business and launch. So we're 6 months in at that point. And within 6 months, my business multiplied 5 times over from what it was. And probably the biggest, and I say this with pride, but with humility, that the biggest measure of the effectiveness of my strategy is that the brand I went to, and tell the story in the book, was Bergdorf Goodman in New York City, which is an exclusive, one-of-a-kind department store, very, very high-end. The biggest measure of my success is that within a couple of years, I became, and to this day, am an ongoing shopper at Bergdorf Goodman. So imagine the impact of that, right? You go to a business to study what makes people tick to choose that business.
Yeah.
The result of doing that study resulted in so much success. I am now the person that can afford to go there. And so that says all. So step number 1 is perspective. You have to understand the perspective and without judgment, without assumptions. Don't think you understand the millennials until you've walked in their shoes, because you're probably wrong. I have 3 of them. And you have to understand their perspective, right? I could give you tons of reasons why they think the way they do, right? But their most formative years were the most sketchy years in our country, right? 9/11, the Great Recession, parents being laid off. They have every right to be skeptical and not feel like, my kids joke about starter marriages. I'm like, I don't know if they're actually kidding, but I get it. So you have to understand the perspective without judgment, without assumption, that you clearly are just with openness are willing to step into the world. Now that can happen in a variety of ways. You can go to where they go. You can read what they read. I was back in the day in the 80s, it was all brick and mortar. I had to go physically to locations, restaurants and retail. I don't know if it's better or worse, but with the internet today, you can step into the worlds of other people probably easier than I was able to. So read their blogs, right? What do they read? What music are they listening to? I listen to the music that my kids listen to so I can understand their world, whether I like it or not, right? So step number 1 is perspective, and you can't go past go until you've done a sufficient amount of work to really step into their world. And you have to continue to be non-judgmental. When I would hire people to work in my photography business, I would test them, and I would literally take them to neighborhoods that were gated and extremely wealthy. And if that was part of my interview process, and if there was any negative comment about rich people, not hired. Yeah. Right? Zero. I didn't allow my retouchers. I always had retouchers. It was never allowed in my business that anyone could make any critical comment about somebody that they were retouching. Not allowed at all. There were no jokes. Just do it, right? Just do what's right for the people you're serving. I don't need jokes about the thickness of somebody's arms, or won't have it, right? Yeah. So I've always lived and ran a business completely free of judgment and assumption. It was loving. It was a loving business, and that was important to me. That's step number 1. Step number 2, I think, is actually one of the strongest human emotions, and it's familiarity. It is crazy the power of what is familiar to us, how we're drawn to it, very honestly, almost subconsciously. give you an example. I now live in Miami. I've been here for 4.5 years. I moved here from Manhattan. I came down for the winter 4.5 years ago and wound up never leaving, but I didn't come here really to move. But a lot of people told me about this neighborhood in Miami Beach. I now live downtown Miami, but for 2 years, I lived in this area of Miami Beach known as South of Fifth. So I went to, the first time I visited South of Fifth, beautiful residential neighborhood. In the center of the neighborhood is a gorgeous park. In the park is a restaurant. I fell instantly in love. Literally within 2 days, I had a lease signed. I traded in my SUV, walked away with a Mini Cooper. Like, I was in. I went to an accountant. I had to get a new accountant. I was moving my business. And so I went to a new accountant and I said to the accountant, I said, well, so much for saving money. My rent is the same here as it was in Manhattan. And he said, well, you do know you chose the neighborhood that was designed to attract New Yorkers. Like, what do you mean it's designed to attract New Yorkers? Because the park is modeled after Battery Park in New York City. And Smith and Walensky restaurant is in the park, which is an iconic New York City steakhouse. And I was like, oh my God, I've been duped by my own philosophy, right?
Yeah.
The power of familiarity is so strong. We are drawn to where we feel at home. This felt like home, so I made it my home. So the more you can understand what feels like home to your clients. I had to understand what upscale businesses felt like, right? How that, even right down to the design of the website, the language, the clarity, the logos, all of it was part of understanding what the service, how I was to present myself, right? All those things, none of which I knew, but I had to learn it all so that I could create a feeling that was so familiar. To this day, I honestly don't know whether my clients, I often think that they imagine I came from a really wealthy family that I could afford to be a photographer, because I don't think many of them saw it as a really serious business. I provided exactly what they wanted, but I mean, from their perspective as gazillionaires, like, they had to wonder, like, can you really make a living doing this? I don't know. Or maybe they knew where I came from. I don't know, but that's the point. It didn't matter because I created exactly what they needed to feel in order to do business with me. That's the power of familiarity, right? So you really need to understand what the world feels like, and it is a feeling. Unlike the third step, which is style. Style is much more surface level than familiarity, because familiarity has that subconscious pull that we're not even aware of. Style is a conscious decision maker. Right? Style is what stops people in their tracks. If you ever go shopping at like a TJ Maxx where all the shirts of a certain size are together, but they're a mix of styles, you're flipping through the hangers. What makes you stop? The style of the shirt, right? You're like flipping through, you're like, oh man, this shirt is, think about how often we say, wow, this is so me, right? Right? There's something about it that spoke to you, and style speaks to us, literally speaks to us, and it stops us in our tracks. And this is imperative today because people flip through our websites, right? They're flipping wedding photographer. I need a wedding photographer. Let me Google wedding photographers. They're flipping through those websites like hangers on a rack, right? What's going to make them stop is that they feel like, oh, that's so my style, right? Whether it's the style of photography, the style of the logo, the styles of the colors. A photographer I worked with a number of years ago, he had such an edgy style that literally his wedding clients, we refer to them as backyard pig roast brides, right? Because that's really who he worked with. Like, he wanted the tattoo brides. So you could imagine, what does the style of how he puts himself out there need to look in order for the tattooed bride having a pig roast wedding, for her to be stopped in her tracks? It has to look entirely different than everybody else's. That bride isn't going to pick a traditional looking wedding photographer. She's looking for the edge. Right.
And I think, to your point, you represent that in, not just the photos, but like the language that's on there. There's a difference between being a wedding photographer and a luxury wedding photographer, 100%. That just puts people in a different frame of mind about what as they engage with you, what their expectation is and whether or not you're the right fit for them.
Right. I mean, what should the background of the website look like? Should it look like flowing lace, or should it look like scratches on, on chalkboard or something. You can start visualizing what it needs to look like, and that's what style is. Style is, it's a surface level, eye-catching style that matches how your ideal customer sees themselves, that stops them in their tracks.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to understand what's their style. Is it serify? Is it traditional? Is it contemporary? Is it, you have to really understand that. Again, how do you know that? You have to go to where they go. You have to, one of the exercises I often do with clients is just ask yourself this question. Which of the 4 typical grocery stores is your client likely to shop in? Are they Whole Food shoppers, Trader Joe's shoppers, Publix, or Costco? Just know that.
Yeah.
Right? Because each of those 4 brands of grocery stores have very different styles. So if you can at least put them in a bucket of grocery store style, you can now start imagining what's the style that you need to capture. I think we'd all agree the vibe of shopping at Whole Foods is very different than Costco. Right.
Well, of course, and I think we as a company always talk about, we hold the art of photography, the discipline of photography with a lot of reverence, right? It's an important discipline. We have this concept of photos matter, sort of like this rallying cry that we surround internally, that's sort of ever present. And part of it is because photographers see the world differently. You talked about that peripheral vision. And I think that power of observation that you're talking about as being a necessity for those first 3 steps actually puts photographers in a really good place to do this for their own business, because it's just about, they're in a portrait shoot, it's about, getting acquainted with that subject, that individual, to pull their true self out. Well, you already see it, right? And now you just got to get them to show it. And so I think that's a good way to look at those first 3 steps, is just observe, do what you do best. And to your point, identify what type of grocery store do they go to? What kind of, communities are they in? What kind of events do they attend?
Car brand, right? There's tons of comparisons you can make, but I love everything you just said, because honestly, in the depths of my soul, I actually believe this. It's why my podcast is called Creative Warriors, and it's been in existence for 6 years, because this has been the message. I think creatives are the warriors today. The creatives, we're on the front line. I've been in business for 35 years, Matt. There's never been a better time for business owners that are heart-centered, purpose-driven, creative, empathetic. All the soft skills that corporate world has been ignoring is exactly what resonates for consumers today, and we're best at it. There's never been a better time for us to exist and excel in business, because of our skill sets that's natural to us. So let's go on to the 4th step then, which is pricing, because I know photographers get so caught up in a knot over pricing. There's 2 things you need to know about pricing will solve all your problems. One is pricing creates perception. You can decide, in fact, you need to decide exactly how you want your business to be perceived before you even begin to price yourself, right? So when I started my photography business, I did not want to be perceived as a photographer. I wanted to be perceived as the choice from portrait painting. And portrait painters, my clients, I did a little research. People were spending about $20,000 to have their kids painted. And I'm like, for half the price, I can create a beautiful work of art that will stand up against any painting they're having done. And it'll be half the price. They'll be thrilled. And it will be obviously a better likeness. So I priced myself for an average sale of $8,000 to $10,000. I didn't even decide what the prices were going to be. I decided what I wanted them to invest, and then positioned myself by charging that much. They didn't even consider that I was a photographer. Really, it didn't matter. I was just an artist who was going to capture a likeness of their kids. Camera was just the medium of choice.
Yeah.
Right. But I created a perception. And that's the thing. I mean, think about what's your perception if you go into a restaurant that doesn't have prices on the menu. You know what you're in for. Right. So it's arbitrary, but what you want to take control of is, how do you want to be perceived? Do you want to be perceived as very high end? Do you want to be perceived as a little high end? Do you want to be perceived as the affordable choice? No, it's up to you. One is not better than the other. I think for a lot of photographers, I like to describe a good perception as the smart choice. And what that means is that you're higher than average, but not so high that people have buyer remorse and feel stupid about what they overinvested. Okay. So I like the smart choice positioning so that you're not falling into a commodity and just pricing yourself at, low, but you're pricing yourself as a stretch for people, but not so high that they feel stupid because they later on find out that they way overpriced. Okay. So that's step number one with pricing is you control how you want your business to be perceived, and make sure you convey that feeling in the amount that you're charging and even the look of it, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Right. I was always on the high end, prices are all rounded off. Right. You go to a high end store, the prices are $100, $500, $1,000. You go to Walmart, it's going to be $34.16. Right. That's just the psychology. So there's a look to it too. On the high end, you want to just round it off. Don't be overly specific. On the low end, you want to be very specific. Right. The second thing to know about pricing is you have to align yourself with how your client sees themselves in the world. If they see themselves in the world as needing to be cost conscious, then you have to look and feel and be priced that way to match them. If they see themselves in the world as only worthy of the best, then you better, which is my approach, you have to look, feel, and be priced as if they're only for the best. You're not for everybody. Yeah. That alignment takes care of everything. You don't have the issue with people trying to talk you down. The entire reason why photographers have a challenge of people asking for discounts and trying to talk them down is because you've not created an accurate price point impression before people walked in. And that's your fault. I'm very blunt about that. Right? If you don't want to waste your time with customers that can't afford you, then make sure you look accurate, the actual look, feel, style, that you feel your price point. Do yourself a favor, and the people that can't afford you should know that simply by looking at your brand.
Yeah. So then let's talk about the final step.
Yep.
Choosing
the last
the right
step
word
is lingo. Right now, you can actually speak to them. Right. Without that information, you can't even begin to create marketing materials and a website. Otherwise, you're going to be saying the wrong things to the wrong people or the right things to the wrong people. It's not going to be aligned. You have to understand how they see the world, what feels familiar to them, the style that stops them in their track, and you have to understand how they see themselves in the world to price yourself accordingly. Now, you can create a website, marketing materials that looks like them, feels like them, is using the right words, even degree of humor, right? There's different degrees of humor. Look, comedians are very good at this, right? Some comedians are really foul-mouthed. Well, they're not for everybody, right? So to what degree do you use language and humor and words? Do you speak formally, casually? Is there humor? I'm working right now with a branding client who is a tour guide, a trip guide. He organizes and trips for people. And he's young and energetic, and we're intentionally making his language hip because that's his ideal client, right? He's not going to do trips for 60 and 70-year-olds. He's doing honeymoons and organizing trips and doing really cool expeditions on these trips, right? So it has to feel that way. It has to be that casual Instagram language is what I call it, right?
Well, so to kind of summarize for everyone, then we're going to take a couple of questions from the listeners. It's about knowing your own perspective in order to then identify whose perspective do you want to associate yourself with in terms of like knowing their perspective. Who's that audience you want to know their perspective? Create the familiarity, present your business in their style, attract them with the right price based on the strategies that you shared, and then choosing the right words. So don't just jump into the words. Do that observation, do your due diligence. You said you gave yourself 3 months. So, take the time to make sure that, you're doing it the right way.
100%.
So one question that came in, Jeffrey, was what do you think about offering a customer the opportunity to make their photo shoot bespoke? Is that a good marketing tool, to let that individual be in control of what the shoot looks like? Yeah.
So, and just know up front, I'm really picky about, you have to decide whether bespoke is the right word. I mean, I know what bespoke means, it's custom, but it's an old world word. So is that your client, for one, right? And it very well may be. Like bespoke clothing is, you know what it is, but it has an older genre, an older feeling to it, which may be, so versus custom or unique, might be more contemporary ways of saying it. But I think flexibility is the key nowadays. So in order to justify my high rates, years ago, time was a differentiator or a qualifier, I should say. So I would tell people your sessions were going to be 3 hours long and people were into it. Well, nowadays it's the complete opposite. People will pay you more to save them time. So I like to, knowing there's a variety of clients, I would say something like sessions can be as long as you'd like it to be, or as thorough and short and quick as you'd like it to be. So I think in photography now, because you have some people that are going to see value in having a lot of your time, the majority of people by far are going to see value in you saving them time. So one of the worst things you can do as a photographer today is talk about how long it's going to take. If you make it seem like it's too big of a deal, you actually are scaring off a fair number of very contemporary, high spending clients today. So I think you can make it custom, but not to the degree that it's going to seem like a lot of extra work for them, because that's the last thing people want is extra work today.
Yeah. So someone was inquiring about the phrase and getting your thoughts on the phrase, if you work for the wealthy, you will. And if you work with the masses, you'll work with the masses. And so I guess that's kind of the point that you've really been summarizing today, right? It's if you be clear on who your audience is, be specific in how you speak to them, and those are the people that you're ultimately end up working with.
Yeah, and here's, I think what's really important about that is you can never, there's a thing in business where you can go from class to mass, but you can never go from mass to class, ever, right? So there was a day back in the day, cell phones were only available to rich people and celebrities, and now everybody has them across all socioeconomic groups. So that's typical of class to mass. But Home Depot will never succeed at trying to be a high-end boutique, ever.
Yeah. Right?
They own their space, so that you have to be careful. You have to pick and choose. So you can, if you had to pick and choose, I would not be, and this is why even during this time, you have to be really careful of how you might be changing up your business to make a few bucks, because you may have a really hard time recovering from whatever damage you do to your brand if you suddenly go a really heavily discounted route because you feel like you have to. You really can't recover from that once you've given people an out. So I would agree with the statement that if you work with the wealthy, you'll be. If you work with the masses, you'll be. Yeah.
Well, and I think that the kind of one last question before we start to wrap up a couple of other topics I want to address. This is all predicated on saying, being clear with who you work with means that you're going to have to say no. So the question of well, how do you learn to do that, especially at a time right now where, everyone's trying to figure out, well, there's so many types of photography that isn't allowed, right? But how do you, learn to say no, and what are the advantages of that?
Well, you will hopefully only have to say no for a short period of time. But trust me when I say the path to exponential growth, the path to the results that you want in your business is working with your ideal customers. Because guaranteed, every one of us, every one of you listening in know that those customers that you've bent over backwards for, you've jumped through hoops for, they're almost always the least profitable. The customers that are a breeze to work with, you love work, they allow you to do the best job you've ever done as a photographer, they're almost always the most profitable. The more you can hone in on them, the quicker the word will spread about how exceptional you are, because you're working with people. And I think the most, people look at who's your ideal customer often as the most profitable. That's important. But I think the most important part about working with your ideal customers is that they enable, as photographers, they enable you to do your best work. That's what spreads quicker than anything, how amazing your talent is and how great the experience of working with. So don't work with the wrong people because you're squelching that spread. Yeah. So you may have to say no for a while, but you won't have to say no for long. And the more clear that you can present yourself by speaking the lingo of your ideal customers. Lingo should be both a magnet and a filter. It should absolutely magnetize your ideal customers, and the wrong customers should just stay away. So the clearer your brand presentation is, the clearer you're speaking their lingo, the less likely you'll have to say no to anybody, because you're only bringing the right people in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I want to shift gears a little bit as we close things out, because I think there's some important topics that I'd love to get your perspective on for our listeners. You put out a lot of content around the payroll protection program, as so many people around the country have had their lives upended by COVID-19. What would you say to attendees who either haven't applied or who have applied and are just caught up in the process? What would you share based on the research you've done?
Yeah, I jumped on this quick because every hair on my body went on end as soon as there was talk about there being some financial aid, because what we're used to, us self-employed folks, is that we're always overlooked. We have forever fallen into the gap between, hey, let me send you $1,200 for a stimulus check. Like, that's not going to pay my business bills, but not being big enough to get small business loans because they require a minimum of 10 employees. So there's a huge swath of us that have always been left out, and it pisses me off more than anything. I'm writing my next book. My next book is specifically for self-employed people, and there's an entire chapter devoted to this feeling and the solution for it. Now, what made the CARES Act so unique is that for the first time in history, there was specific language in the bill for self-employed people. Now, what I knew is that the government, not understanding our worlds very well, because they don't follow my lingo steps, if they had, they would have gotten it right. But I knew that it was going to be very confusing, as it was, because the CARES Act talked a lot about employees. What you have to understand is, under the premise of self-employed, we are our employee. Just self-employed people, we typically don't think of ourselves as our employee unless we're an S corp. So that the language I knew was going to be confusing. So as soon as there was talk about financial aid, I dove in deep. I fortunately have connections into politics, so I was able to get a hold of this bill before it was released. And much to my surprise, there was language in there specifically for self-employed people. Very satisfied about that, but at the same time, I knew there was gonna be some confusion. So I jumped on the bandwagon very quick, put out a video. I got a hold of a banker who was really clued in on this, brought him in within 3 days. That video had 15,000 viewers, more than my TEDx talk, by the way, that I put a lot of effort into. But I don't care, I got the word out there, but people needed the help. So what I would say now is the following. And since then, by the way, I've also, on my podcast, I was able to not just broadcast 2 weeks ago, an interview with Keith Hall, who is the president and CEO of the National Association for Self-Employed. So I ask all of you listening whether you're even aware that that organization exists. Right? It's NAS. Sure. Was new to me. I've been in business 35 years, and I chastised him for that. I'm like, how is it I've been in business for 35 years and didn't even know there was a trade association for self-employed people? You all have marketed this really badly. Let me help you. So I'm hoping to step into like a spokesperson, role for them at some point, because they actually are doing very powerful legislation on our behalf in Washington. So the future looks bright. It really does. They're working on some really cool things. And here's the reason why. It's not by any means that we have a government or an administration who is all for self-employed people. The reality is that we have power now. There's 30 million people that file a Schedule C as self-employed people. There's 57 million in the gig economy, if you can include how people file differently, but 30 million people actually file self-employed. We have power now in ways that we never have. And here's the really cool thing that a lot of people may not be aware of. Because of what's going on with COVID-19, huge unemployment. What are those people doing? They're becoming self-employed. People that are the rate of self-employment goes up when unemployment goes up. All right, so now we're getting more people on the team. So we're getting more power. So what you can do now is, first of all, the best way to get the PPP, and I'm not really sure where we stand on the deadline. I believe the deadline had passed, but I still would get in the conversation, and straight from Keith Hall's mouth, the CEO of NASE, he believes, as I do, is there's going to be more money coming. All right, we've had 2 rounds of funding available for PPP, but it hasn't gotten to everybody. The second round went much better. The first round was a bit of a debacle. The second round went much better. I think there's going to be more. So I would get whatever you have, get in a relationship with a banker who can administer the loan, and maybe get an application in, because they are processing the applications in queue. And that's important to understand. If your application is sitting in queue and the money ran out, if there's more funding, you're first in line. So regardless of whether how hopeful you feel, get an application in queue. I know masses of people that got it. And it's pretty cool. When you get it, it comes in really quick, like approval one day, money in your account the next day, direct deposit. And it is likely forgivable. What that means is that you probably won't have to pay it back. Now, this is remarkable. The criteria for it becoming forgivable, now we'll all see what happens most of us got the money in April. A huge amount of people got money in April, which means we'll see what we're facing in June. But if I follow how it's written, come June, we will have to show how we use the money. Now keep in mind, the PPP stands for Paycheck Protection Program. So it is meant for employers to be able to provide paycheck to their employees. As a self-employed person, you are both your employer and payee. So in theory, as long as the money you got from the PPP goes to you personally, you've just protected your paycheck. And it should be forgivable 100%. All right. So in theory, like I said, we'll see how they interpret it. But what I have done is, I mean, the money comes in a big chunk. And what I'm suggesting to people is when you get the loan, it comes in a one amount, put it into your business account, and then withdraw out of the business account into your personal account as if you're paying yourself. It doesn't have to be equal amounts. If you've paid yourself like most of us do when you need it, it's okay. Just replicate that. It doesn't even have to be the same amount. The key though is, and please, every person listening in, if you aren't already set up with a business account and personal account, that's step number one. Do not run your business out of a personal account. You need to have a business account that when you make money, it goes into that, and you transfer money from your personal account, from your business account to your personal account. If you haven't done that, do that, because that's going to be imperative to the future. So I would say keep at it. It's the only thing worth fighting for. Some people are getting unemployment. In some cases, people are getting more money from unemployment. The PPP is based on your monthly average salary that you've been paying yourself, and they will give you two and a half months. Right. So if, just for easy numbers, if you've paid yourself $10,000 a month, you could get a loan up to $25,000. Likely, you will not have to pay it back. If you have to pay it back, it's 1% over 2 years, which I've also been telling people, don't get hung up on it even being forgivable, because if for some reason it's not forgiven, it's the cheapest money you will ever get. 1% interest, just pay off credit cards, which you're paying 18% on. Right?
Well,
so it is truly historic that this is even an option.
Thank you for sharing those additional insights. And I think you've given us something to look forward to with that next book, which we'll definitely be watching for. There were a couple of questions that came up about how to get the book. So let me just sort of close out our conversation here, Jeffrey, and share a couple of parting pieces of information. First, obviously, Lingo available on Amazon, and I'm sure countless other online book retailers. We're also at Tether Tools. We've taken advantage of having an opportunity to work with Jeffrey here. We've bought a number of copies. And so the next 25 orders on TetherTools.com using the promo code Lingo15 will actually get a free copy of that book. I mentioned earlier we had a winner. We're going to give away a second copy right now. So Sasha Mezik is our second winner of a free copy of Lingo. So we'll make sure to get in touch with her and get her copy. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is, again, we obviously brought this content forward because there's a lot of photographers with some time as they think about and contemplate the best path forward for their business. Now is definitely the time, if you have it, to invest in how do you really hone in your messaging, your brand for the clients that you ultimately are going to be working with moving forward. Obviously, making sure you have all the gear you need to be successful is imperative too. And so working with Think Tank Photo and MagMod, Tether Tools, all of us are going to offer up a 15% discount on any products that you purchase on our websites through May 31st using the promo code Lingo15. So thank you all for attending. Thank you, Jeffrey, so much for sharing all of these insights. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right.